Rain hammered the pavement as Daniel Carter jogged home from the grocery store, his jacket already soaked through. Then he heard the scream. A pregnant woman had collapsed beside the crowded bus stop, one hand clutching her belly, the other reaching out desperately. People walked around her like she was an obstacle. A few slowed down. Phones came out, but no one knelt. No one except Daniel. He dropped his bags without hesitation, cans of food rolling into the gutter, and slid to his knees beside her. "Mom, stay with me." He gently lifted her head and tucked his only jacket underneath. Cold rain mixed with her tears as she looked up at him, terrified. "My baby, please." Daniel's heart pounded. He waved frantically at passing cars, shouting, "Someone call 911." A man in a sharp suit glanced over and kept walking. "I'm already late." A woman nearby whispered to her friend, "Better not get involved, you never know." Daniel turned back to the stranger, wiping rain from her face with his sleeve. "It's okay," he said softly, though his own voice shook. "You're not alone. I'm right here." She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, eyes wide with fear. "Please don't leave me." Daniel looked into her eyes and gave her the calmest smile he could manage. "I'm not going anywhere." Several agonizing minutes passed before a taxi finally stopped. The driver rolled down his window. "I'm not taking blood in my car. She's having a medical emergency," Daniel shouted. "Then wait for an ambulance." The cab sped away. Daniel's heart pounded. He reached into his wallet. $38. It was everything he had until payday. Without hesitation, he stepped into the road and flagged another taxi. "I'll pay whatever it costs." The driver hesitated, then unlocked the doors. Daniel carefully helped the woman inside. "What hospital?" the driver asked. I don't know," the woman whispered. "The nearest maternity hospital," Daniel answered. As the taxi sped through traffic, the woman fought to breathe. "My name is Emily. I'm Daniel." She looked at him through tear-filled eyes. Why are you helping me?" Daniel gave a tired smile. "Because if my mother had ever needed help, I'd pray someone would have stopped." Emily tried to say something else, but another sharp pain stole her voice. By the time they reached the hospital, Daniel had spent every dollar in his wallet. Doctors rushed Emily through emergency doors. A nurse blocked Daniel's path. "Family only." "I'm not family." "Then you'll have to wait." He nodded, suddenly aware that his clothes were soaked, his shoes were covered in mud, and he'd missed the job interview he'd been walking to. Hours later, a doctor emerged. "Are you Daniel?" He stood immediately. "Yes. You saved 2 lives today." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "The mother and baby are both stable." For the first time that day, he smiled. The doctor continued. "She asked us to find you." Daniel followed him into a recovery room. Emily looked exhausted, but she managed a small smile as she cradled a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. "You stayed." I said I would. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to." "No," she whispered. "You don't understand." She reached for the bedside table where a nurse had placed Daniel's damp jacket. "I noticed your wallet fell open." Daniel looked embarrassed. "You saw that. There wasn't much inside." He laughed softly. "Not anymore. You spent everything." "It wasn't much. It was everything you had." Daniel shrugged. "Money comes back." Emily stared at him for several seconds. "No," she whispered. "Not everyone believes that." She asked the nurse for a pen. "I want your address." Daniel shook his head. "Really, it's okay. Please. I didn't help you because I wanted anything." "I know." She smiled through fresh tears. "That's exactly why I need it." Reluctantly, Daniel scribbled his apartment address on the back of an old receipt. Emily folded it carefully and tucked it inside her purse as if it were priceless. "I'll never forget today." Daniel smiled politely. "You should focus on your son. You saved him." "No," Daniel replied quietly. "His mother did." Before leaving, he gently touched the baby's tiny hand. "Welcome to the world, little guy." The baby's fingers wrapped around one of Daniel's. Emily watched silently. Something about that moment stayed with her long after he walked away. Outside the hospital, Daniel checked his phone. 8 missed calls. 1 voicemail. He listened. "Daniel, this is Martin from Harper Logistics. Since you never showed up for your interview, we've filled the position. We wish you the best." Daniel closed his eyes. That job had been his chance to catch up on overdue rent. Instead, he had chosen a stranger. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and started the long walk home beneath the rain. He never told anyone what had happened. Not his landlord, not his friends, not even his younger sister, Lily, who worried enough already. When his landlord knocked 3 days later demanding late rent, Daniel simply apologized. When electricity was shut off the following week, he lit candles. When his refrigerator emptied, he quietly skipped meals so Lily wouldn't know how difficult things had become. Life moved on. Weeks turned into months. The receipt with his address remained tucked safely inside Emily's purse. More than once, she thought about calling. But every time she picked up the phone, something stopped her. Not because she'd forgotten, because she wanted to repay kindness with something greater than words. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, Daniel opened his apartment door and froze. A small package sat neatly on the welcome mat. No postie, no return address, just one handwritten sentence. Some promises are worth waiting for. His hands trembled as he slowly opened the box. Daniel carried the package inside, as though it might disappear if he moved too quickly. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of an old fan struggling against the summer heat. He placed the box on the kitchen table, staring at the neat handwriting again. Some promises are worth waiting for. He frowned. I don't know anyone who'd write this. The box wasn't expensive. Plain brown cardboard. Carefully taped. Almost ordinary. Almost. He peeled back the tape. Inside rested a baby blue knitted cap, perfectly folded. Underneath, it was a photograph. Daniel picked it up, and his breath caught. It was a newborn boy from the hospital. Only now the baby looked about a year old, sitting in a patch of green grass, laughing at something outside the frame. His dark curls had begun to grow, and the smile on his tiny face seemed impossibly familiar. On the back of the photo, someone had written, *, he's learning to walk, because you helped him live. *. Daniel lowered himself into a chair. Emily. Beneath the photograph was another envelope. Inside lay a single invitation. Please meet us tomorrow at 2:00 p.m. Riverside Community Center. *, please don't say no. *, no signature. None was needed. Daniel smiled despite himself. I guess she's finally calling. The next afternoon, he almost didn't go. His shirt was faded. The collar had started to fray. His only pair of dress shoes had cracked soles that squeaked with every step. He stood outside the community center, suddenly feeling out of place. What if she just wants to say thank you? He muttered. What if that's all this is? He nearly turned around. Before he could, the front doors opened. A little boy with unsteady legs came toddling toward him, laughing as he chased a bright red balloon. Behind him came Emily. She looked healthier than Daniel remembered. Confidence had replaced the fear that once filled her eyes. The moment she saw him, tears welled up. You came. Daniel smiled. You asked nicely. Emily laughed through her tears. Then something unexpected happened. The little boy wandered directly toward Daniel. Without hesitation, he reached up with both tiny arms. Daniel looked behind himself. Is he reaching for me? Emily nodded. He doesn't usually do that with strangers. Daniel carefully lifted the child. The little boy giggled before grabbing Daniel's nose. Emily laughed harder. I've told him about you since the day he was born. Daniel looked surprised. He doesn't understand stories yet. No, she smiled warmly. But I wanted the first story he ever heard to be about kindness. Daniel couldn't find the words. The child rested his head against Daniel's shoulder as though he'd known him forever. Emily watched quietly. His name is Noah. Daniel looked down. Noah. The little boy patted Daniel's cheek and smiled. Something softened inside Daniel that he hadn't realized had hardened over the past year. Emily noticed. You've had a difficult year. Daniel shrugged. Everyone has. You lost your interview. His eyes widened. I never told you that. The hospital called that company while you were waiting with me. Daniel blinked. I didn't know. They told us. She hesitated, and I found out a few other things. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. You didn't have to investigate my life. I wasn't investigating. She reached into her purse. I was trying to understand the man who spent his last $38 on a complete stranger. She handed him a folded newspaper clipping. Daniel opened it. It was about a neighborhood food drive. There's a photograph of him unloading donated boxes. I remember that, he said quietly. You volunteered there. It wasn't a big deal. Emily smiled gently. You weren't receiving food. No, you were giving it away. Daniel looked down. There were families worse off than mine. Emily pulled out another clipping. This one showed firefighters outside a burning apartment building. A sentence had been circled. * local resident Daniel Carter helped rescue 2 elderly neighbors before emergency crews arrived. * You never mentioned that either. Daniel looked embarrassed. It happened years ago. You inhaled smoke. I recovered. You missed work. I found another job. Emily shook her head. You keep saying these things like they're ordinary. Daniel smiled awkwardly. They are. No. Her voice cracked. They aren't. She took a slow breath. I asked around because I couldn't stop thinking about that day. Daniel stayed silent. I expected to discover one incredible act. She looked directly into his eyes. Instead, I discovered an entire life built on helping people who could never repay you. Daniel looked away. I just do what I can. Emily's voice softened. What? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, when I was 12, my father collapsed at a grocery store. Emily listened closely. People walked past him. Her smile faded. Someone eventually called for help. He swallowed hard. But they waited. His eyes became distant. They waited because everyone assumed someone else would do it. Emily reached across the table. I'm so sorry. He didn't survive. Silence settled between them. Daniel continued quietly. I promised myself I'd never become the person who keeps walking. Emily couldn't stop crying. You've been keeping that promise ever since. I've tried. Noah suddenly reached up and placed his tiny hand on Daniel's face. The room fell silent. Emily whispered, sometimes children understand more than we think. Before Daniel could respond, the doors to the hall opened. Nearly 50 people began walking inside. Teachers, nurses, older couples, teenagers, a mail carrier, a mechanic, a waitress. Daniel frowned. Emily, she smiled through tears. They're all here because of you. He looked confused. I don't know these people. Emily shook her head. You do. One by one, the strangers stepped forward. An elderly man removed his cap. You fixed my flat tire on Christmas Eve. A waitress smiled. You paid for my groceries when my card was declined. A college student wiped away tears. You gave me your bus fare and walked home so I could make my entrance exam. Daniel stared in disbelief. I barely remember. The young woman smiled. I never forgot. Another voice spoke. You shoveled my driveway after my surgery. You donated blood for my husband. You stayed with my daughter after her accident until I arrived. You repaired my porch without charging me. You bought my son's school supplies. Every sentence landed harder than the one before it. Daniel looked at Emily, completely overwhelmed. What is all this? She squeezed Noah's little hand. It's only the beginning. Then the crowd slowly parted. A sharply dressed older gentleman stepped through the opening carrying a leather folder. He stopped a few feet in front of Daniel. My name is Richard Bennett. Daniel offered a nervous handshake. Nice to meet you. Richard didn't take it immediately. Instead, he said quietly, I've been looking for you for almost a year. Daniel's smile faded. And what you did for Emily gave me a reason to keep searching. Richard opened the leather folder and slid a document across the table. Daniel glanced down. The first line made his heart skip. Offer of employment. But before he could read the company name, Richard said something that left the entire room speechless. Daniel, before I offer you this job, there's something you deserve to know. And with that, he reached into the folder and placed a faded photograph on the table. A photograph that somehow connected Daniel's late father to Richard's own family. Daniel stared at the faded photograph as if it belonged to someone else's life. It showed two young men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of an old construction site, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders, laughing at something beyond the camera. One of them was unmistakable. His father, 25 years younger. Daniel's fingers trembled as he touched the edge of the picture. That's my dad. Richard Bennett nodded slowly. His name was Michael Carter. Daniel looked up, confusion replacing surprise. You knew him? Richard drew a long breath. He saved my life. The room fell completely silent. Daniel blinked. What? Richard lowered himself into a chair across from him. 30 years ago, I was a young foreman who thought I knew everything. One afternoon, a steel beam snapped loose on the construction site. His voice grew quieter. I never even saw it falling. He looked down at the photograph. But your father did. Daniel swallowed. He pushed me out of the way. Richard paused, emotion tightening his throat. The beam crushed his leg instead. Several people in the room wiped away tears. Richard continued. Your father spent months recovering. The injury never healed properly. It changed the course of his life. Daniel felt his chest tighten. My dad never told us that. I know. Richard nodded. Because he made me promise never to speak of it. Why? He said. Richard smiled sadly. If you spend your life paying me back, you'll miss opportunities to help someone else. Daniel closed his eyes. That sounded exactly like his father. Richard continued. He refused every check I offered, every gift, Every favor. So you never repaid him? I tried. Richard's voice cracked. He kept saying the same thing. What? Pass it on. The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. His father had died, believing no one remembered. Yet here sat a man who had carried that debt in his heart for decades. Richard looked around the room. When Michael passed away, I couldn't find his family. Life pulled us in different directions. He turned back to Daniel. Then last year, Emily called me. Daniel looked at Emily in disbelief. You know Richard? Emily nodded. He's my father. The room seemed to stop spinning. Daniel looked from Emily to Richard and back again. You. Emily smiled through tears. I never told you my last name. You're Emily Bennett. Daniel leaned back, stunned. Richard gave a small laugh. The day you saved my daughter and grandson, you unknowingly fulfilled the promise your father made me 30 years ago. Daniel whispered, I don't understand. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Michael refused repayment because he believed kindness should never end with one person. He gestured toward Emily and Noah. You saved my family. Then he gestured toward himself. And now, after all these years, it's finally my turn. Richard slid the employment papers closer. I own Bennett Industrial Group. Daniel looked down at the company logo. His eyes widened. It was one of the largest manufacturing companies in the state. I heard you missed an interview because you stayed with my daughter. Daniel nodded quietly. I did. You sacrificed your future for someone you didn't know. I just made a choice. No. Richard smiled warmly. You made the same choice your father made. Daniel slowly looked through the papers. The salary alone was nearly 3 times what he'd ever earned. Health insurance, retirement benefits, paid education, housing assistance. He looked up immediately. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. I don't have the qualifications for this position. Richard smiled. I've read your resume. Daniel looked confused. You have. I've also spent the past year talking to everyone you've ever worked with. Daniel's face reddened. You did all that. I wanted to know if the man who helped my daughter was simply kind or whether kindness defined his character. Richard chuckled softly. Do you know what every single person said? Daniel shook his head. They all described different moments. He pointed toward the crowd. Helping co-workers, covering shifts, mentoring new employees, returning extra change, cleaning up after others had gone home, staying late without asking for overtime. Richard smiled, but every story ended the same way. Daniel waited. That's just Daniel. Tears blurred Daniel's vision. I've never been anyone special. Emily stepped closer. Exactly. She gently rested a hand on his shoulder. You never helped people because anyone was watching. Richard nodded. Skills can be taught. He tapped the employment contract. Character cannot. Daniel looked around the room. Many of the people smiling at him were complete strangers. Yet every one of them carried a memory of something he had done and forgotten. The elderly man with the flat tire spoke first. I wouldn't have made it to my wife's bedside without you. The waitress smiled. My daughter starts college this fall because of the money I saved that day. The college student added, I'm a nurse now. Daniel's eyes widened. You are. She nodded proudly. I've delivered 23 babies. She looked toward Noah. And everyone reminds me that my future almost disappeared the day my bus fare came up short. Another woman stepped forward carrying a little girl of about 6. This is Ava. The little girl smiled shyly. Daniel waved. The mother said, she has the heart you donated blood for. Daniel looked confused. My blood. She nodded. The hospital found a match just in time. Daniel covered his mouth. He had never known who received that emergency donation. The mother whispered, every birthday she celebrates exists because you answered a phone call. The little girl stepped forward and hugged his leg. Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Daniel couldn't hold back his tears anymore. Richard quietly said, do you see it now? Daniel nodded weakly. I think. No. Richard smiled. You only see a handful of stories. He looked around the room again. There are hundreds more we never found. Emily added softly. Acts of kindness almost never end where we think they do. Just then Noah reached into his tiny pocket and pulled out something folded. Emily laughed. I almost forgot. She unfolded the small paper. It's for you. Daniel recognized the uneven lines immediately. Crayon. Noah had drawn 3 stick figures, one taller than the others. One woman, one little boy. Above them was a crooked yellow sun. Across the bottom, Emily had written Noah's explanation. Asterisk. Mama says heroes don't wear capes. They stop walking. Asterisk. Daniel stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his wallet. not where money belonged, where reminders did. As the room filled with quiet applause, Richard extended his hand once more. So, a smile spread across his face. Will you let my family return just one small piece of the kindness your family has given mine? Daniel looked at the hand, then at Emily, then at Noah. Finally, he smiled the same gentle smile that had comforted a frightened stranger one rainy afternoon. This time, he accepted the handshake. Daniel's hand lingered in Richard's for a moment longer than either man expected. It wasn't because of the job. It wasn't because of the salary. It was because, for the first time since losing his father, Daniel felt as though a piece of his family had been found. Richard smiled. Welcome to the Bennett family, Daniel. Applause filled the room. Daniel instinctively looked down, embarrassed by the attention. I don't know what to say. Emily laughed softly. You don't have to. You never seem to. The crowd chuckled. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out one last envelope. I have one more thing. Daniel accepted it cautiously. Inside was a key. Not a car key. Not an office key. A house key. Daniel frowned. I don't understand. Richard folded his hands. When Emily learned about your apartment, she insisted we do something. Daniel immediately shook his head. I can't accept a house. Emily interrupted before he could continue. You haven't even heard the whole story. He looked at her. We didn't buy you a mansion. She smiled. We restored one. Daniel looked confused. Richard continued. 3 months ago, your landlord decided to sell the duplex where you've been living. Daniel's heart sank. He never told me. He was planning to give you 30 days' notice. Emily nodded. So, we bought the property. Daniel blinked. You what? We bought it, Richard repeated. You own my apartment building? Emily grinned. For about 12 weeks now. Daniel looked completely speechless. Richard couldn't help laughing. You've been paying rent. Daniel nodded slowly. We've been putting every dollar into an account with your name on it. Daniel stared. You never spent it? Richard shook his head. We wanted you to have it when the time was right. Emily added, enough for a fresh start. Daniel lowered himself into the nearest chair. I don't know what to say. Emily knelt beside him. Then let me say something. He looked at her. 1 year ago, I asked why you helped me. She smiled through tears. You answered, because I'd hoped someone would help my mother. Daniel remembered. I've thought about those words every single day. She glanced toward Noah, who was happily chasing his balloon across the hall. My son will grow up hearing that story. Her voice trembled. But he won't only hear what you did. Daniel listened quietly. He'll learn why you did it. Richard nodded. Compassion isn't just something we admire. He smiled at his grandson. It's something we teach. A quiet voice interrupted them. Excuse me. Everyone turned. It was the elderly man whose tired Daniel had changed years earlier. He cleared his throat nervously. I'd like to ask everyone here something. The room fell silent. How many of us are only here because Daniel helped us? He paused. Or because someone Daniel helped later helped us? Hands slowly began to rise. 1, 5, 10, 20. Nearly every person in the room. A nurse smiled. The woman who became a nurse because Daniel paid her bus fare. She pointed toward the young nurse. Was the one who cared for my husband after his stroke. The mechanic laughed. The college student Daniel encouraged became my daughter's teacher. The waitress added. That teacher inspired my son to become a paramedic. Another voice spoke. That paramedic saved my wife's life. The room grew quiet again. Richard whispered, Look around, Daniel. Daniel did. What he saw wasn't a crowd. It was a chain. One act leading to another. One kindness becoming 10. 10 becoming hundreds. Hundreds becoming lives forever changed. Tears rolled freely down his face. I thought I was helping one person at a time. Emily gently squeezed his arm. You were. She smiled. You just never got to see the echoes. Noah suddenly ran back toward Daniel and wrapped his tiny arms around his leg. Up! Daniel laughed through his tears and lifted him into his arms. Noah rested his head against Daniel's shoulder exactly as he had done a year earlier in the hospital. Richard watched quietly. You know, Daniel looked up. I think Michael would be proud. Daniel's voice barely rose above a whisper. I hope so. Richard smiled. I know so. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening. People began saying their goodbyes. Not with hurried waves. With hugs. With gratitude. With stories Daniel had forgotten, but they never would. As he prepared to leave, Emily stopped him at the door. There's something else. Daniel laughed. Please tell me it isn't another surprise. She smiled mischievously. It is. He shook his head. I should have guessed. Emily pointed toward a bulletin board near the entrance. A new sign had been placed there. It read, "The Michael Carter Kindness Initiative." Daniel's eyes widened. Below the title were the words, Asterisk, helping strangers become neighbors, one act of kindness at a time. Asterisk, Emily said softly, "We'll provide emergency assistance for families in crisis, scholarships for students, transportation to hospitals, and meals for anyone who needs them." Richard placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "And we'd like you to lead it." Daniel turned around, overwhelmed. "Me? Who better?" He looked at the sign again. His father's name, his father's legacy, his father's promise. Passed on. Daniel smiled through tears. "I'll do it." Months later, stories began to spread across the city. A single mother whose rent was quietly paid. A veteran who received life-saving surgery. A teenager who earned a scholarship after nearly giving up on school. An elderly couple whose home was repaired before winter arrived. None of them knew the entire story. Most never met Daniel. They simply experienced the kindness that continued to ripple outward. One rainy afternoon, almost exactly 2 years after Daniel had stopped beside a frightened pregnant woman, he noticed a teenage boy kneeling beside an elderly stranger who had fallen on the sidewalk. People walked past. The boy didn't. Daniel smiled. He didn't interrupt. He didn't announce himself. He simply watched as another person chose compassion over convenience. Then he quietly continued on his way, knowing the ripple was still growing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more stories filled with kindness, hope, and unexpected twists. Share this story with someone you love, and let us know in the comments. What was the biggest lesson you learned from Daniel's journey? As Daniel disappeared into the crowd, he carried nothing extraordinary in his hands, just an old wallet with a child's crayon drawing tucked safely inside. Yet the greatest treasure he possessed had never been money or recognition. It was the quiet certainty that every time someone chooses to stop instead of walking away, the world becomes a little kinder than it was the day before. Because kindness is the only gift that grows larger every time it is shared, and the smallest act of compassion can echo through generations in ways we may never live long enough to see.